Hello and welcome to the CX Files for May 30th, 2024. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan coming to you from a very sunny Montreal, Mark. It's getting into the full summer in Canada right now, the 2 or 3 weeks we actually get of summer anymore, but we're taking full advantage of it.
Yeah, well, it's been kind of weird in Brazil because when I was over in the US for the CXO with you, I expected to return and face winter, because winter here is actually in the middle of the year. But we've been getting sunny days and about 30 degrees Celsius. So it's like, well, what happened to winter?
Yeah, I just can't predict the weather anymore. It's getting really bizarre. Well, I mean, it's been bizarre for a while. And at the end of the day, you just sort of take it as it comes. As we're recording this, Mark, we're supposed to hit 40 degrees in Montreal. 40 degrees Celsius in May. It's unheard of. But at the end of the day, nothing makes sense anymore when it comes to the weather. But,
Yeah.
we're talking a little bit about Canada and some of the weather patterns. Let's talk CX in Canada. We had a really interesting interview this week with Michael Morrison. Now, those of us who are in the Canadian frame of mind when it comes to CX will know Michael because Mike's been around our space for quite some time. He's truly a veteran. His current role is he's the Chief Revenue Officer at NCRI. He's based in the Toronto area. Now, the impetus for our chat today came from a lunch that I had with Mike a few weeks ago when I was visiting Toronto. I caught up with some friends down there. Mike obviously is somebody I've known for a long time, and we always enjoy our get-togethers. We spent about 3 to 4 hours with an extended lunch in downtown Toronto, catching up on all things CX, but also some topics near and dear to your heart and mine, music and movies from the 1980s. Mike's got quite the collection of vinyl, and we really enjoy our discussions. But I said to him, there's a lot of misconceptions about the Canadian CX market, and there's a lot of, I'd say, misunderstanding about what's going on CX wise in this country. Let's be frank. Canada's a developed country. Canada's a consumer economy. But when you compare it to our neighbors to the south, the United States with 350 million consumers, or the UK with 70 million, or anywhere such as Germany, France, we're dwarfed. We're not a big priority in the eyes of the CX tech players or the outsourcers. So what we did was we caught up with Mike to try and debunk some of the myths about Canadian customer experience management, as well as to provide a little bit of insight in terms of where the sector is going. So a really interesting chat from somebody who has been eating, breathing, and living customer experience in Canada for quite some time.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we don't sort of think of Canada as somewhere really within the BPO market, because I guess normally we're always thinking of the major locations for the clients, or the more remote locations for BPO delivery. So
Yeah.
it should be interesting. Maybe we need to sort of think of some more regions around the world where we don't really sort of cover it. I mean, places like the UK, for example, have got enormous capacity for BPO delivery, and yet
Yeah.
normally you hear people talking about offshoring from the UK. So that could
Yeah.
be interesting.
I think you're raising a really interesting point. And in the situation of Canada, we've had a bit of an issue where we've had waves where Canada's being positioned as the nearshore north, usually based on the fact that the exchange rate of the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar takes a plunge. So you get an arbitrage based on currency. Then when the dollar appreciates, then all of a sudden Canada becomes an attractive demand market, and a market that's looking to try and source services from other parts of the world. But at the end of the day, what I think Mike brings to the table in our chat is some clarity in terms of what the Canadian dynamic is in CX. Is it a market that's got a reputation for being cost driven? Is that really the case? Is it a market that is better situated as a nearshore north versus the United States, or are we able to stand up as a key sourcing demand market in our own right? And if we go to the interview with Mike now, he'll answer these questions and many more that anybody wants to know about, as we call ourselves the Great White North. This week's CX Files, we are so happy to bring in a fellow Canadian, and that is Michael Morrison, who is the Chief Revenue Officer for NCRI Inc. He joins us from his offices in Toronto, a city where I was visiting, and we had an amazing lunch a couple of weeks ago. Mike, great to see you again, and so happy to have you on the CX Files for what I believe is your first appearance.
Yeah, great to see you too, Peter. And correct, first appearance, although it has not been that long since you and I had a chance to sit down and have a chat, like you said, about a week ago. So happy to be here.
Thank you so much, and it's really great to have you. You know, as I think a little bit about the work that you have done in the CX space and the BPO space, specifically within Canada, you've got one of the best pedigrees, I think, of anybody out there. And that's really what we want to touch on in today's episode, Mike. You know, the reality is, I think that Canada is known for a lot of things. You know, we're known for ice hockey. We're known for Bryan Adams. We're known for, the founding insulin. All these types of things. But one aspect of the country that we are not known for is customer experience management and BPO. And I think that that's unfortunate because there's a lot of interesting nuances as it relates to the Great White North when we can talk about customer experience. So, as a starting point, talk to us a little bit about your period in the space. How has customer experience evolved over the course of your career from a Canadian perspective?
Yeah, I was thinking just the other morning, Peter, that when I look at the dollar, for example, and where it is, it hasn't been at these levels since about 03, 04. And if I think back to my time in the industry back then, there were a couple things happening. There was a pretty significant influx of U.S. Business into the Canadian market because of the favorable exchange. And I think that in the early days of Canada's sort of maturing in the BPO space was really focused a lot on supporting U.S. clients from the Canadian market as opposed to Canada for Canada delivery. And what we saw in sort of the mid around 2000 and I think 13, 14, when the dollar approached almost par, the business model changed almost overnight. And a lot of that business that was going into Canada from the US market found, other homes in other nearshore geos, just based on that favorability equation kind of evaporating. And what it did is it forced the industry to kind of reinvent itself around Canada for Canada delivery. There was an awful lot of, I remember we went through a few periods where there was an awful lot of empty capacity call centers that were just sort of emptying out. And so it really kind of forced kind of reimagining what Canada's role was and whether really there should be more focus on domestic delivery for domestic clients. And I think, what I've seen really ever since, and part of my recent move and change to a bit of a smaller organization is that, by comparison, the Canada for Canada work is smaller, if you think about like for like versus the US market. And so I think there's a certain segment of this market that, although offshore is attractive, I'm not sure that some of the business here is attractive to some of the larger tier one BPOs. And there's always been a bit of a challenge, I think, up here with maybe part of the point you made in kind of introducing the question, that I think there's selective interest in this market by some of the large tier ones. There's a certain size requirement that it needs to fit. And I just feel like there's a huge segment of this market that's underserved, that isn't necessarily being pursued by large global players. And so there's really a nice balance now, I think, in a home for some of the smaller BPO players to service either Canada-only brands or brands that may be global in scale, but just have a small presence here in the market. So, again, I just think the shift over the last 20 years or so has been more around focus on domestic clients and domestic delivery versus the U.S. business. But we are seeing now a trend back where, again, the U.S. companies are becoming a lot more interested in this market again because of the favorable dollar. So there's always sort of been those ebbs and flows, and predominantly driven by the FX rate between our two countries.
So you have touched on something very interesting there. And I can recall the days where we would be looking at the Canadian market and it was heavily, heavily focused around American investment, nearshore north, and depending on the rate that the dollar was at, that would really depend the number of workstations that were occupied. But let's talk a little bit about this. Let's go on a bit of a tangent here about perception versus reality. Mike, one of the things that I hear from so many different organizations, especially foreign ones that play in Canada, is that Canada is heavily revolving around cost, that it's a cost-driven market, that Canadian enterprises don't necessarily want to spend the money needed for quality. All they want is the cheapest price. How do you respond to this assertion? How do you respond to this perception that I think has plagued Canada for some time?
Yeah, I'll tell you that, just to pick up on the thought I ended with, I think the other risk now is there's ways to drive cost out of the operation other than just by simple shoring. So I think the risk for Canada is that, for example, relying heavily on US investment here because labor cost and delivery cost is lower. But with, the introduction of AI and other emerging tools, they're providing other opportunities for our clients to save cost. And so I think we have to continue to try and lean into that shift in the delivery model here in Canada. And, I still see, and I guess my biggest point of frustration when we're out in market is RFPs that seem to be behind the times in terms of the buying process. So we have a process right now we're involved in where there's almost no questions about technology or AI delivery. It's all about, who's going to be willing to take these calls and do them cheaper than the current vendor. And this sort of race to the bottom approach to, winning BPO deals by, trying to just drive cost out of the business. We're in a market right now where costs are escalating in Canada and the US. Inflation is high, labor cost is high. And so I just think that there's got to be more opportunity to engage with clients in conversations about driving cost out through ways other than, simply, finding 10 companies that are willing to submit a bid and scoring. In my opinion, pricing is scored higher as a percentage of the overall score than perhaps it should be. And that, I think the sourcing model needs to shift. I used the analogy with a client a couple of weeks ago where, if you're hiring a CEO, you don't bring in procurement to see if you can find the lowest cost compliant CEO. It's such an important role to your business. And yet frontline employees that deliver these services on behalf of their customers are treated almost like a commodity. And so I think it's more of a value conversation than a price conversation. I know that sounds cliche, but at the end of the day, we're trying to engage earlier with clients and have conversations around what the pain points are and to offer solutions that might be outside of what they would typically ask for in an RFP process. And I find that the difficulty is even when you proactively volunteer those solutions in an RFP, the RFP isn't really built to score them. And so clients are happy to hear alternate proposals, but the scoring mechanism isn't designed to create the right amount of points, if you will, for those types of solutions. And so, again, I think it's really just comes down to the buyer maturity. I think the industry is evolving at such a rapid pace now that I'm not sure a lot of client buyers, have sort of caught up with the opportunities now to go to market in a very different way. And to secure proposals that are based on transformational themes rather than just low-cost execution. So, our goal is to be in earlier, ahead of RFP, trying to inform that process, trying to help clients understand the alternatives that are out there, and then hopefully influence the way that, in cases where they have to go to bid, that you're influencing the sourcing model. We really are starting to just step away from those RFPs that look like, they're designed to deliver exactly what I described in terms of sort of this race to the bottom approach for, the lowest cost compliant bidder. We just, trying to step away from those and focus our energy on those clients that want to sit down and have a conversation and let us have the opportunity to kind of bring the right delivery model and value to the table.
Okay, cool. Now that leads me to a question about the buyers themselves, Mike. And when it comes to the buying community in Canada, I think historically there's been another perception that it's a very limited number of fish that you're angling for. The story I've always heard in Canada is that traditionally outsourcers have been going after about maybe 2 to 3 dozen large scale enterprises in retail banking, insurance, telecommunications. But I have a sense in Canada that the economy is evolving like it is in many other Western countries, where now you've got perhaps organizations that are expanding rapidly in new verticals, new industries that maybe didn't even exist 10 years ago. And they're desperately looking for strong CX partners who are going to pick the mantle up. They're focused on quality as opposed to cost. They're focused on innovation. And are you picking up the same thing right now, that we're moving away from the usual suspect clients that everyone's going after, and now there just seems to be a few more targets to be throwing the darts at?
There we go. Sorry, I had the mute on. Yeah, always a bit of a danger in picking winners and losers in some of the emerging markets. So, there's, I was reading recently just the number of health tech startups we have in this country in the hundreds. Fintech as well, startups, I think we're certainly more open now to looking at emerging markets like you describe, and businesses that seem to be on the right trajectory. But it is a bit of a risk. I think, the opportunity for us anyway in this market is somewhere in the middle. You described it perfectly. There's, probably 30 or 40 logos that most large tier ones I mentioned earlier sort of selectively in this market. Those are the clients they're after. But I find that there is a segment of this market that sort of sits between those companies and the startups that are just, perhaps Canada only brands, Canadian retailers, that just don't have the size that sort of resonates with some of those larger tier one players. I worked in companies in the past that walked away from, talking about Canadian brands that would be household names like Roots, for example. And them needing smaller numbers of support than most of the tier ones would be interested in taking on. So I think that there is a market somewhere in the middle for those companies that maybe just fly under the radar of the large tier ones, but are still mature businesses and are still fairly safe plays. And I think that, as a Canadian operator, we certainly resonate well with those types of companies. We know the market, we know those brands, we're often consumers of those brands. And I think that there is enough to play with in that sort of segment of the market. And quite frankly, a lot of the reason that I made the shift that I made recently, and to kind of come back to a Canadian owned and operated and led BPO business that is absolutely focused on this market. So to me, there's still ample hunting ground here. I think you do have to position though, in terms of value that, this, Peter, better than anybody in Canada and the US. There are hundreds of BPOs. It's getting very difficult to have a differentiated message. And so I think that's where the real work needs to be, is more consultative with clients and to go in and have those conversations around, creatively solving business challenges. If you're getting engaged at the RFP stage, it's a grind, so we're trying to identify the right segment of the market that fits for us, be in earlier, and to have those conversations with clients that could result in us selling nothing but technology to a client.
Yeah.
We're open to those types of models as well. It's expanded beyond simply filling seats into a model where you can deliver tech, and hopefully, through those relationships, build and grow into delivery down the road, but it's not required up front. I think there's lots of things we can do even for captives. And that's another big segment of the market that we're focused on, is companies that want to operate internally, but really feel like they can benefit from some of the best practices and tools and expertise that a BPO can bring. Co-sourcing models are interesting to us right now as well for that reason. So I think you just have to, as you described it, imagine the market a little differently, and try to move to a place where there's less competition and where you can have more meaningful conversations with customers.
So talking about meaningful conversations, talking about the basis of communication, that leads me to a very uniquely Canadian question that I know that you've dealt with over the course of your career, and that is the bilingual nature of Canada, which is very unique. We've got some pressure points when it comes to servicing English and French simultaneously, especially for larger national brands. As we say in Quebec, it's les deux solitudes. How can a CX provider manage the bilingual nature of Canada in an era when we know that customer expectations in French and English are incredibly high, and the tolerance for, I think we can all agree, linguistic disconnects that we do get from time to time, especially in French with overseas agents, are becoming more of a common thing. What do you think, Mike, the recipe is for managing this in 2024 and beyond?
Great question, Peter. And I one thing I've seen is a focus certainly on markets. For a long time it was Quebec and where you needed to be to really deliver, French language. Certainly at scale, that's still true. But there are a number of pockets in the country outside of Quebec where there's also French language availability, and I'm seeing more and more, companies starting to look at really trying to immerse themselves in all of those various pockets, throughout the country. I think that helps from a recruitment standpoint, drawing off a wider sort of labor pool. But I think the challenge for a lot of our clients when they come to us is exactly what you described. They're engaging because they simply cannot either find or maintain French language. And this, you kind of bring this back to where I started again with the sort of sourcing model and the design of how a lot of clients are buying services. You really need to, in this market right now, be willing to invest in certainly at the agent level. And I just find that, the price points that sometimes are the winning price points in these processes, for me, I struggle to understand how an organization can deliver quality at those rates. And so this is where I come back to, I think labor is the wrong place to be looking for savings. I think you need to be willing to invest to get the talent, especially in a market as tight as it is right now for French, and then leverage other capabilities to drive cost out of the business. So it's just not an area right now where you can really drive down cost. We are all recruiting in the same markets for the most part. And if I feel like I need to be at a certain rate in that market to get good talent, I scratch my head sometimes looking at a competitor who's offering that same talent for $3 or $4 an hour lower. Our message to clients is invest in people. Don't shortcut that cost. Find other ways to drive cost out of the business. But you have to be willing to pay at market rates and invest right now in this market for sure to secure those language skills. There is no shortcut. But I just think it's the wrong place to look to save cost. I think you have to be willing to not only pay to attract that language, but to attract top talent to your site. French language employees in this country right now in the call center industry know that they can pretty much work wherever they want. And so, you've really got to have, I think, a robust, not just compensation, but benefit culture. There's a lot more, I think, involved in it, and not just attracting, but retaining that talent. And again, I think you have to invest in it. And, back to my comment earlier, we will step away, I think, from opportunities where clients don't seem to be on the same page. Because as we all know, if you back into a model that, requires you to lower that pay rate, you inevitably pay for it somewhere else in the relationship in terms of quality, delivery, penalties. So I've seen that repeat itself enough times in my career to know that it's the right strategy. And I think we just need to work with clients that understand that.
You talk about some of the pressures around finding French language talent, and I totally relate to what you're talking about. The fact is, we're down to pockets of French language speakers outside of Quebec, whether we're talking in Eastern Ontario or in Winnipeg or in New Brunswick. The reality is we're talking about maybe 10, 15, 24 people at most that you're going to be able to bring in at any one time. Yeah. And that places the emphasis then. Do you go to Morocco? Do you go to Tunisia? Do you go to Central Africa? Yep. And even in those locations, the markets become quite tight for the talent. So really, as we're thinking about bilingual support, English and French simultaneously, or even just French exclusive support, the challenges I think are going to be significant. And there needs to be some forward-looking, some forward vision in this country, as you say, not just doing things as usual and looking for the cheap option. But as we wind up our chat today, Mike, I'd be curious if you can talk a little bit about what do you see on the horizon moving forward for customer experience management delivery in Canada. Where do you see this market going if you were to prognosticate in a crystal ball for the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, so I think, I was reading the other day that, surprisingly, still only 32%, I think it was Frost and Sullivan, 32% of companies are delivering, AI that is sort of agent assist or sitting behind the agent type support. And then 37% have started some type of virtual agent type delivery model using AI. So I still see that there's a lot of opportunity there. I think it still dominates the conversation. right now, but I still see a lot of nervousness and apprehension on the part of customers in terms of how deep do we go and where do we go, and so what I think you're going to see is a bit of a split between what I call customer facing AI that sits between the customer and the business, and agent facing AI that sits between the agent and the back end of that company. There's a lot that you can do with AI that a customer doesn't even see, that's still human delivered, but creates a ton of efficiency on the back end. And this is what I talked about earlier when I talk about driving cost savings. I think we're going to see a shift as organizations get better at understanding how to buy these services, that we will see more of those types of approaches in terms of, when companies are looking to drive costs out of a business. I think it's still catching up a little bit. I think those numbers certainly suggest that, more companies than not are not deploying AI today. And I do think part of that is just the maturity in buying those services and understanding what's available and how to deploy it and where do you mitigate risk. There was something I remember reading a few months ago. I think it was an airline that had a bot that gave a customer incorrect information and then tried to fight the case in court and lost. The position being that, you choose to use the bot, you're on the hook for whatever the bot says. So those kinds of stories, I think, certainly make regulated industries very nervous. But, this is where we really try to initiate, these conversations with clients around, let's just sit down and have a conversation about the art of the possible. It doesn't have to be customer facing. I'll give you a great example. In the telecom industry, I had to call and change internet providers a couple of weeks ago. And, more often than not, they become like 30 to 40 minute phone calls that don't need to be 30 to 40 minutes because there's so many different systems. An agent is working in and putting you on hold and initiating all of the things that need to happen to roll a truck and update your billing. I think there's tremendous opportunity in that sector specifically to do some of that work on the back end in a more automated fashion so that the agent, doesn't need to keep a customer on the phone for, 30 minutes. I noticed Bell, I think just in early April, announced a partnership with Google's CCAI product. They're going all in on delivering, or developing and building, much stronger AI models for agent support. So good to see that that's starting to happen. Again, I think we'll just continue to see, as the technology matures, more and more companies understanding how to go to market for it and how to make it part of their buying process and how to leverage those kinds of tools rather than simply trying to drive cost out of, there is no cost to drive out of labor or lease, or, there's a certain cost structure here that, it is going to be there. That's where I'm seeing, I think, the biggest shift over the next 5 years or so. And what I hope, will continue is this, again, I think, the market continues to mature around, suppliers like us that are Canadian based, that are smaller, that are willing to take on those clients that perhaps are not as attractive to the big players. And I think that we're going to continue to see a bit of a wedge there too, because there are a lot of companies I find in Canada that were captive that are now reaching out saying we're struggling. They're too small, I think, for the large players to really pay attention to. And so, tough markets in this business are good for us, top operating markets, because it challenges, an internal organization's ability to continue to do it on their own. And I think it's opening up a lot more opportunity for companies like us to be part of that conversation where maybe previously we weren't.
Good stuff. Well, Michael Morrison, Chief Revenue Officer from NCRI Inc. It has been great to welcome you to the podcast. This will not be our last conversation, I can promise, either online or over extended lunches or potentially even a few beers. But honestly, this has been very enlightening. The Canadian market is one that I know intrigues many people from different parts of the world. And you've done more to shed light on this, I think, in 30 minutes than at any other point we've had on the pod. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.